Hello once again, everyone. Another week and another video. So today we're going to be doing a slightly different sort of format, as I am sitting at my desk but not drawing this time, and we're going to be talking about an antique sword of mine, as well as some other weapons from the period it comes from, and some fun anecdotes from there. So, firstly, this is the antique we'll be talking about. This is the 1840 pattern of NCO sword. This one is specifically dated to 1862. So, why did I get this sword? Where did it come from? Story of that. I was in Savannah, and I was walking around an antique shop, and I saw this guy leaning up against the wall. Now, this is rare for several reasons. Firstly, you don't find a ton of swords in American antique. Well, you do, but they're not good. You don't find a ton of good swords in American antique shops. More commonly, I'm finding them in the Southeast, which is cool, but it's just not all that regular. And you certainly don't find them outside of a glass case. So usually the way I have to look at these swords is I'm leaning over a glass case for hours at a time trying to figure out what I'm looking at, versus this guy, I could walk over, pick him up, and immediately learn some things. So let's go over the overall condition of the sword as well as some parts of it. So first things first, it has been snapped. This happened way before I had it, and based upon the patina, I would guess that it probably snapped when it was still in pristine condition. I can't confirm that, but that's my hypothesis. It would have had about 3 more inches of blade on it. But beyond that, we also have 2 decent nicks that have been, they're right underneath my thumb, that have been ground down or have naturally covered by the patina. These look like general use nicks, as we've got a little bit of blade damage from about here to here, which is honestly pretty ideal for where you'd be parrying. Now, whether that happened in combat or practice, who can say? It might have even been from just various owners of this sword mucking about. But beyond that, not a ton of edge damage. The blade is pretty much straight, with the exception of a slight tilt out by where it snapped. And then the Maker's Mark, which we'll be going over in more detail, somewhat covered. It was enough I could make it out to figure out where it was from, but well, we'll come back to a little more details about that, but it's still present. The handguard, meanwhile, has some damage. So brass, not that strong. The knuckle guard has been flexed significantly out of place in the bottom, and then this flange has been pushed up. Pommel's still in good condition, and the grip is a little loose, but not that bad. So, first off, why would I buy a broken sword? I've never had really that much interest in the American Civil War, and I do more now, but I didn't initially. And why would I buy something that is broken? Well, the reason I bought it is because I picked it up and it felt good, honestly. I mean, I've held a lot of antique swords over the years, and when I held this one, it just felt really good. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to appreciate this for what it is. I'm going to get it. And it's also a really fun research piece. So let's talk about some of the things I figured out. So first off, the 1840 pattern of NCO sword would mostly be carried by Union sergeants, though Confederate sergeants would probably carry a knockoff of this pattern or whatever personal arm they had. This was originally based off of the 1817 French smallsword. Now, it's not actually a smallsword, it is a spadroon, and if you want to see a video that goes into detail about spadroons, check out Matt Easton's channel. It's become a bit of a meme. But basically, spadroons are kind of a beefed-up, military-esque smallsword. Now, the reason that we went with a French pattern is that apparently the U.S. just has this weird history of mostly liking French patterns of things. A few exceptions here and there, but this was what proved popular, and so that's what we adopted for our NCO sword. And this does actually still see kind of use in certain parade situations, but this is, by all accounts, a pretty good spadroon. It is a dedicated thruster. It's not meant to be a cut and thrust. Not that you can't cut with it, but the edge is never going... I mean, I could sharpen this, but the edge is never going to be all that incredible because it just doesn't necessarily have the weight or blade presence behind it to make a good cutter. But as a thruster, it has a nice thick spine. It really is meant for the thrust, and it would do a fantastic job. I've actually even read some accounts by Civil War reenactors complaining and thinking that Union swords or just swords of the period were not made all that well because they don't cut all that well. Well, if they were using these, it's because it's not meant to cut. So as a thruster, this is fantastic. Now, who made it? This was made by the Collins and Company of manufacturing of Hartford, Connecticut. And that's where we get into a little bit of interesting history about not only this sword in particular, but manufacturing and about the craziness of weapons production in the Civil War. So basically, when the Civil War breaks out, you have you've got one major company that is making weapons, and a lot of these pattern swords that you'll find, by the way, were made by Ames. And Ames also made them for, I believe, the Mexican-American War, which is also where this pattern saw action. Now, Ames couldn't make everything. Ames was making swords, it was making cannons, I don't think it was producing firearms, but either way, they were making pretty much most of the other munitions. Well, all of a sudden, the Union found itself in a very awkward position because with the southern states seceding, they lost a lot of armories and arsenals down there. Now, not a ton, a significant amount, but they suddenly had to scramble to outfit a wartime army. And the South had to do the same as well, and the South even had it harder. But basically, I could compare this to when Saruman in The Lord of the Rings has to outfit all the Uruk-hai by basically playing Minecraft in his front yard. These guys were scrambling, and all these manufacturing companies pop up all over the United States to make weapons. Collins and Company Manufacturing was one of those. They were up in Hartford, Connecticut, which apparently had a bit of a boom thanks to the Civil War because they were producing all these different weapons. But here's the fun thing about this this particular sword, and that makes it different from an Ames, is that one, the guard is differently constructed. With an Ames, this would be a solid piece. But with Collins and Company, it's 3 pieces. So it's the guard itself, it's the knuckle bow, and it's the grip, which is why the grip is loose, is because it is a separate piece. The other fun detail about this, that I only found out today, actually, is that according to Fagan Arms, which is an antique dealer, a reputable one, only 648 of these were made, which means that I am holding a very rare sword. I wish it were in better condition, but still, I had no idea at the time that this would have so much history attached to it. But either way, so would this type of sword have seen combat? I think this one had a good chance of it. I can't confirm it saw combat. I can probably confirm that it was carried, but whether or not it actually was used, maybe. So the reason I say that is because, one, it was made in 1862, which is right at the start of the war. So things were a little bit different at the time. You know, there was a more romantic ideal of the war, much like World War One. The older technology that would be considered outdated by the end of the war, including officers carrying swords, at least by American standards, was not yet this interest in that was not seated in the mind yet. It was still considered to be a romantic thing, a quick war, blah 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 blah. So the fact that it was made in 1862 tells me it has a better chance of seeing combat. The damage on the blade, as well as how it broke, and my theory on the patina gives me the inclination that this probably broke either in training or maybe use. These nicks are decently significant. Not huge, but they're right where I would be parrying with if I were using this, so it's possible. The damage on the guard, I think that was just later in its life. Like I said, brass is not particularly strong. It's probably just got smushed here and there. It'd be nice if it got damaged by something cooler, but I can't ever confirm that. So, this would have been carried by Union sergeants and other NCOs. Now, some NCOs would be equipped with a rifled musket like everybody else, but oftentimes an NCO's job is to rally the men, to work with the officer, etc. And as per the time, officers and NCOs would be basically positioned in the middle of the formation, swords out, leading the men, which also gave them a rather high casualty rate. Hence why we kind of stopped carrying around swords in such a way. But another thing to consider is that in close quarters combat, which did happen in the Civil War, certainly not as much as some other wars, but it did certainly occur. A sword is not just to be thought of as offense. It's also to be thought of as defense. So Matt Easton has talked about this a lot in several of his videos on swordsmen of the British Empire, which I highly recommend you either read or watch his vids on, or both. But when you are an officer and a sword is what you have, and maybe you have a pistol, probably you have a pistol, this is what's keeping you alive against, frankly, much better suited hand weapons. Someone's thrusting at me with a bayonet, I have to use my sword to defend myself. Because if nothing else, just being able to use this as essentially a shield is a big part of its job. And against thrusts and cuts, this is an excellent defensive weapon. So I think if it did see combat, or certainly its brothers that did, probably it was in that regard, more as a defensive weapon than an offensive weapon, or even possibly as a weapon of intimidation. Crazy guy running at you with a sword is pretty scary if you've just, spent your whole life growing up on a farm in Virginia. So, either way, that's a little bit about my actual antique. But let's talk about some other swords from the period, as well as some other weapons from the period, because I do have a couple other things to share. So, I mentioned that a lot of American patterns of sword at the time were based off of French patterns. That's not universally true. However, we do have another example. So, a rather famous sword, especially in pop culture, more within the past decade or so, is the 1840 wrist breaker. So what is the wrist breaker? Why does it get its name? What's its purpose? And why is it famous? So, the 1840 wrist breaker is the 1840 U.S. cavalry saber, heavy cavalry saber specifically. It was used in the Mexican-American War and then up through the Civil War, and was kind of replaced by the 1860 light. Not officially replaced, but basically that was what people were moving to. Why does it get its name the wrist breaker? Because it's heavy. It has a wide, thick-spined, long blade. This is one that I have tried using on foot, not in actual sparring, but just doing exercises. Just no, not that you couldn't. It is not meant for foot. It is meant for you being on a 800-pound horse and hitting somebody that way. But this was based off of the 1822 hussar pattern of a French saber, and you would also see some, however, that were based off of a Prussian pattern, and so had a straight blade. And many of them were also foreign made, so you would see them imported, a lot of them from Prussia or Solingen, and so they would often have straight blades. So you will see differences between them, but they're meant to be basically the same pattern. Now, what preceded this, and why did we go to this heavy thing? Well, that's a little bit of kind of, dare I say, American overcompensation, which a good buddy of mine, we talk about that in regards to combat knives quite often. But basically, the sword that preceded this guy was the model 1833, which was kind of the first standard cavalry sword that the U.S. had ever adopted. And it was based off of a British pattern, and by all accounts, it was a good-looking sword, but user reviews were not great. They found that it was too light and would often wrap around people's heads when you cut them, or break, or things of that matter. There's even one anecdote that says the only thing it's good for is cutting butter. Now, we hear complaints about that a lot in several different instances. For example, in the British Army, there was complaints amongst the cavalrymen that the 1790, either 97 or 98 pattern was not very good. But then you also had the King's German Legion or the King's German Hussars who were, bisecting people's heads with them. So maybe it's probably user error. But either way, it wasn't proving popular, so they decided to get a new one. And they got a bunch of different swords, somewhere in the realm of ordering 1,400, foreign swords for testing. And this would have been in the 1830s. And this was the one that won out. This was what they thought was great, and so this is what we carried. It saw a lot of action in the Mexican-American War, and it saw a decent amount of action in the U.S. Civil War. Now, we do even have some accounts of it being used on foot here and there. There was an account that I read today about a Confederate was he colonel? Colonel or corporal, I can't remember. But basically, he and his men were set upon by a group of Union sympathizing natives, and the fight was during heavy rain, so their carbines failed to fire, and so they had to resort to hand in a breakout action. So these did see action in that regard. You also do have some accounts of cavalry on cavalry fighting in the Civil War, certainly in the Mexican-American War, as well as just in general hand-to-hand conflict. But when it comes to cavalry in the U.S. Civil War, we start to see some very interesting evolutions. But before we get into that, I suppose we should talk about the parts of this, and as well as some anachronisms. Let me go over that real quick. So like I said, this sword is a modern reproduction. It is actually my father's, and it has his name and rank at the time stamped on it, which is pretty cool. But as far as, what is essentially a dress sword or a wall hanger goes, this one isn't that badly balanced or poorly constructed. It's pretty good. I think it's a little bit too heavy, probably. A little bit chunky, but it's not bad. So, biggest thing you will notice when it comes to looking at actual antiques of these, that's the biggest difference, is this. This is what's incorrect, mostly. Basically, in an actual 1840, this brass backing doesn't go down the whole way. It cuts off right about here, and then the leather and cord wrap would be what's covering there. So if you see that, not that some swords don't have that, they do, but the 1840 does not. So if you see that, that's a big indicator. However, the guard would have been brass or steel painted brass. That's not that uncommon. Blade length, this is pretty much accurate. Weight, not too far off. The weight is all the way out there in the blade. I mean, you drop your arm and it just wants to go. I can only imagine what cutting with one of these feels like. But anyway, back to cavalry in the Civil War. So at the beginning of the war, both sides kind of thought cavalry's outdated. We're not going to need it anymore. It's grandpa's war. However, very early on, both also realized with the vastness of American battlefields, having mobile scouts or harassers was incredibly useful. And many guerrilla groups on both sides were basically entirely cavalry. So both sides quickly reinvested and cavalry was put back into action. Now, a funny anecdote here is that when it comes to Union cavalry, if my horse gets shot out from under me, I can report back to my commanding officer, say, hey, sir, I lost my horse, and he's going to yell at me, and then a new horse is going to be ordered, and I'll have one. When it comes to being Confederate cavalry, however, most horses that were brought were privately owned. In fact, in general, the Southern cavalrymen are known for being better riders because they mostly grew up on farms. They brought their own horses to war, and if they lost their horse, the South did not have the ability to replace that. So if I was a Confederate cavalryman, my horse gets shot out from under me, I go to my officer and I say, hey, I lost my horse. He's going to tell me, okay, you got 30 days to get a new one or you're infantry. So that's a really big difference, and it does kind of explain why their tactics might have evolved so drastically, because North and South cavalry are quite different. So Northern cavalry is going to be your standard continental, if you will, cav. They're going to be, equipped with sabers still. They would have one or two pistols, carbines sometimes, and they'll be serving as scouts, support, and flank, etc. Southern cavalry, on the other hand, they mostly did away with the sabers. Some still carried them, absolutely. And this led to a bit of contention between Northern and Southern cavalry, with Northern cavalry often calling out Southern cavalry as, not being gentlemanly for forgetting their swords. I can't actually confirm that, but I found a couple instances of it being mentioned here and there, so maybe I'm propagating a myth, maybe not. Grain of salt, research it on your own. But either way, Southern cavalry would instead usually carry multiple pistols and use more harassing tactics. Could this have been because they wanted really not to lose their horses? I think that's a big contributing factor, but this leads to famous Southern cavalrymen such as Jesse James, Bloody Bill Anderson, Quantrill's Raiders, all of whom were notorious for carrying multiple pistols, upwards of 6 on their person. And these would have been revolvers, so that way they can just loose off shots from distance, run away, whatever they need to do. So that difference in strategy is really apparent and rather interesting because, it kind of is the birth of the cowboy, if you will. Not that there weren't cowboys before, there were certainly vaqueros, but the American ideal of it. But either way, so that's the 1840 and a little bit about it. So now let's talk a little bit about, one more detail I meant to talk about. So like I said, some of these were straight bladed and quite a few of them were made in Germany. You also had some people using their own personal weapons, not just the South either, but also people from other countries who came to join in the war. It's a crazy thought. Well, it's not even that crazy, I suppose. We got people who did that in Crimea and the Ukraine war. But basically, you had a bunch of people from Europe who either had former military service or just wanted an adventure and came over, ran through the blockade to join one side or the other, usually the South. But there is a rather famous individual by the name of Heros von Broch, who was, by all accounts, a very tall gentleman, probably about my height. He was originally a Prussian cavalryman, and he came over here and joined up with the Army of Northern Virginia, and was rather distinguished in the way he fought. He was a kind of a big part of the Army of Northern Virginia's efforts because he was, by all accounts, just a good officer, did his job, and was rather notorious for his home-brought sword, which was a large Solingen-made straight cavalry sword. So, given his height, he was probably using a pretty big one. But either way, he saw a lot of action, was wounded a couple times, and even was used as an ambassador at one point before retiring, going back home, joining up with the Prussians again for one more war, and then retiring for good and dying in about the 1890s. So, heck of a life for that guy. And if you're interested, look up Heros von Broch. It's really a cool story, and it's interesting to see how many foreigners basically came over and were like, yeah, let's join in the war, because why not? Either way, though, let's now move on to talking about some other weapons. So, the other big thing I mentioned was pistols. So I've got a couple pistols on my desk here. So firstly, let's talk about these types of pistols and other more outdated weapons. So, first off, there aren't really many outdated weapons, given as a lot of people were self-equipped, especially in the early war. We even have accounts of some of the guys who showed up to the first battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, which was kind of the opening big battle of it. Not a lot, but some of the Confederacy were equipped with like flintlocks because that's what they had. And this is actually a bit of a running theme in that part of the country. But either way, Kentucky long rifles, things like that. Now, some would obviously be converted into percussion cap by that time, but a lot of them weren't. They were just the family gun. And so certainly people would carry single shots like this. Now, would officers be carrying them very much during the mid-war or later war? No. By that time, production of revolvers was pretty common. So, and as well as it being America, so guns were very available. It's kind of a running theme with our country. You could purchase one without that much difficulty. Now, would you still see people carrying these? Absolutely. We have accounts of even infantrymen carrying a backup pistol in case they need it. Sometimes pepper boxes or other close range, just one shot and done. So you would most likely see men carrying these. We also have some patterns of naval guns because the Navy was going through a lot of changes at the time. You do see single shots like this. Usually they're stubby and almost made of full brass. Some even have brass barrels. I don't know why the patterns moved that way. Could have been spar fights, could have been from the fact that ships themselves were changing, and so tactics for the idea of a boarding action was changing. I didn't research it. You should. But basically most single shots are going to be in the service of the Navy. However, you would probably still see people carrying these around, and certainly, like I said, if I'm a cavalryman and I just have this gun laying around, why not carry it? And this shoots a pretty significant round. Either way, you would see people still probably carrying these, even in the late war. Now, the more common things that you're going to be seeing are revolvers. Now, revolvers at the time, we have mine here. This is the Colt 1847 Walker. This is a bit of a fun one. So, revolvers at the time are still black powder, which means that to load this, I have to individually load charges into the cylinder. That means that I have 6 shots. Usually I don't actually put 6 in this, but we'll get back to that. That I then don't really have to worry about. So still people are carrying multiple pistols as their grandfathers, etc. did before, but now you have more shots per pistol. Now, the Colt 1847 Walker is a bit of a fun one. Mostly saw action in the Mexican-American War, though certainly saw action in the Civil War, mostly on the Confederate side from what I've been looking up. And Ian from Forgotten Weapons, if you haven't heard of that channel, go give that guy some views. Ian from Forgotten Weapons has a fantastic video on this in which he breaks down more details, but to paraphrase a brief history of this gun. So Samuel Colt made a pattern of pistol. It was basically a pocket pistol that was okay-ish popularity, but it had his, general action that would prove very, very popular. And he got written to by at the time, U.S. cavalryman, Walker, Captain Walker, who said, "Hey, Colt, I love your idea. Can we make it bigger?" And so that's where this was born. So this is a horse pistol. If you don't know what a horse pistol is, it is a pistol specifically for use by cavalrymen. You would even see, for example, things like this that are even bigger. The idea being that I can drop either horse or man with my shot. So they're usually bigger caliber, longer barrels, heavy. This whole guy is like 4.5 pounds. It's a significant amount of metal. Now, the thing about this one is it has some unique quirks that we'll be getting into, but basically the idea behind this guy was you carried one or two, usually two, on either side of the horse's neck, and you would discharge these while riding, put it away, then draw saber. Though you would still see these carried with multiple others in the Civil War itself. Would you see infantry carrying these? This guy, probably not. Some raiders would probably carry him, and some other guerrilla fighters, yes. But this would not have been a common weapon on foot, rather. Now, a little bit of talking about the gun itself, by the way, is these have the tendency to explode, this one specifically. And I had a close call with this guy last time I fired him. It was fun. So some little things I've learned is, one, the percussion caps have a tendency to fall out, which is just odd. So misfire is decently common. Two, this can carry 50 grains of black powder. I only load it with 30, and frankly could probably load it with less. So again, tendency to explode. And three, the loading lever is rather interesting. So this guy is how you charge whatever cylinder is being loaded. You notice it's held in place with that little tab. That tab is notorious for breaking. So if you ever see a picture of a cavalryman or owner of these, he's got a piece of string tied around that, it's because that little tab broke and he's holding the loading lever up with it. So fun little bit of history there. By the way, this would later be converted into the Colt Dragoon, which is what the Union cavalry would have been carrying more often, and also saw action in the British Army. But a more common weapon that you might see on foot is this guy, the Remington Model 1858. So these are both reproductions, by the way. But what sets this guy aside is that, one, a lot smaller, and two, this has a unique advantage at the time over something like a Walker, and even over something like a Lamat or other revolvers of the time. And I don't have a Lamat. Probably ought to buy a Lamat at some point. But those all you have to basically take apart to reload. So for example, for my Walker here, if I wanted to pop the cylinder, I don't have to take it apart to reload, but if I wanted to pop the cylinder out for whatever reason, I have to hit that tab with a mallet, and then the whole gun breaks into 3 pieces. It's very few moving parts. It's very almost Russian. This guy, on the other hand, if I loose off all 6 of my shots, I can actually reload it more similarly to how we modern day think of reloading. The way I do it is I pull on, I pull on this little guy, which pops out the loading lever, pull this guy up, put it on the half cock, and I can pop the whole cylinder. Hang on a second, it's a little stuck. But, I can pop the whole cylinder, come on now, out of place. So you see how it can be removed. The idea there being that I can carry a spare cylinder that is already loaded in, my coat pocket or what have you. Then if I run out of shots, pop the cylinder out, put the new one in, put it back together, which is, with a little bit of practice, it's not as bad. I'm just still bad at it. And then I'm ready to fire another 6. This isn't shown a whole lot in movies of the time, not movies of the time, movies depicting the time. The only time I've ever seen anyone do that in a film or TV show was in Hell on Wheels, where the main character is he just fired off all his shots and is approaching. It's a very dramatic moment. In slow motion, they show it in great detail. He pops out the cylinder, reaches into his pocket, pulls out a new one, puts it in, and is fully reloaded, which is a really cool detail. But like I said, it's not talked about a whole lot. The only other time I've seen it was in, what's it called? Killing Floor 2. This is a gun that you can use, and they reload it way faster than you actually can, but they at least show it in full detail. Either way, though, something like a Remington would be seen on foot. This would see action in the Union Army and the Confederate Army by officers, NCOs, anyone who could afford it. It would also see action by the British Army. These would be purchased and brought to India even. And so the idea of, British officers using what to most people looks like a cowboy gun is pretty crazy, but absolutely would have been used. Now, the final thing I want to talk about before I finish this video is closer weapons, knives mostly. So Civil War has a bit of a weird thing in that regards to it's kind of notorious for its knives. Most pictures you'll see of either, mostly Confederate infantrymen, but also still Union infantrymen, they will have a large knife fashionably posed in their belt. The Confederacy in particular is famous for its D-guard Bowie knife. But usually what it would be is whatever camp knife you're taking with you. Camp knives at the time are going to be a little bit more hefty, a little bit more kind of like a camp hatchet almost in some regards. Things that you can use to do pretty much anything. So for example, here's something that might have been carried. This is, we call it the pig sticker. And it is not a terribly complicated knife. It is just a big piece of steel that has been sharpened. We even throw this thing. It's crazy. But, something like this can easily gun a man, but could also be used in camp for butchering whatever I'm eating. It can be used to whittle. It can be used to make repairs. It can be used to destroy. It's just your general big camp knife is what this guy is. Now, the more famous thing people think of is, of course, Bowies. Now, Bowie, I have heard it pronounced both ways. I usually go with Bowie because that's what I heard more. So apologies if I am technically pronouncing it incorrectly. But when it comes to Bowies, this is where things get a little more interesting. So you'll see a lot of different styles. Some have, for example, their handle looks like a coffin hilted ones. You'll see smaller or bigger hand guards. You'll see D guards that protect the hand more. But really, it's the blade shape that gives it its distinctive look, as well as its size. So this guy was made in Solingen, which is kind of a nice way to tie everything together. These would have absolutely been used, as a general camp knife and also probably in close quarters. If I lose my bayonet, lose my gun, this is what I'm going to next, and it certainly would do the job. I mean, this thing actually feels like a sword in my hand. Another thing to consider is that at the time, dueling with these was still a decently common practice in the United States, as well as just knife fighting in general was pretty popular on this continent. You had Spanish knife fighters, Mexican knife fighters, American knife fighters, all kind of even making their own schools in some places. There's a lot of interesting reading you can go into at the time. But there are even some states, for example, Alabama is one of them, where the knife laws still kind of reflect the idea of preventing people from walking around with these so easily because it's supposed to cut down on duels with them because so many people are getting cut up or things like that. But in regards to close quarters combat in the Civil War and specifics, you unfortunately don't get a ton of them. We know that close quarters combat happened. It absolutely happened. We have more than a few accounts of it. Cav on cav, infantry on infantry. Certainly when the trenches started to be made and things like that. Battle of the Crater. Oh yeah, that one was nuts. But most of the anecdotes I've been reading don't get into much actual specifics, which is very unfortunate. You don't get the same sort of breakdown that I've gotten from British sources where it's like I gave this cut, he gave that cut back, etc. It's more of we came together, there was a clash of steel, and then one side ran. Or we had to cut our way out, we lost 3 guys. It's usually very matter of fact, which is odd. I don't know, I would have expected more accounts of glorious hand to hand, fighting in the old way, but usually not. Usually it's kind of portrayed as just quick, messy, and then it's done. So I wish I could give more specific details about, infantry on infantry fighting in that regard, but I really don't have any. So all that is to say, however, we've gone over quite a few weapons, but hopefully that was interesting and gives you a little more insight as to the stories behind the weapons that were used in the Civil War and the Mexican-American War. Because a lot of times I find that people don't have an appreciation for them, and don't get me wrong, the U.S. Civil War is kind of a often trod topic over here, so I can get it. I wasn't interested in it for the longest time, but the weapons themselves are very much like the Great War at this intersection of a great change in warfare, and the stories behind them, how they were made, what they were made for, the thought that went into them is really interesting, and it makes things make a lot more sense in regards to the way the war was fought and the opinions of people who fought in that war. But either way, hopefully that was interesting. I really enjoyed this project. Maybe if I have more antiques, I can talk about it more. But either way, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other weapons another time.